New data from Giving USA. Hi, I'm Bill Stanczykiewicz, and this is the first day from the Fundraising School podcast. And I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by two of my colleagues today, Dr. Una Osili. She's the Associate Dean of Research at the Indiana University Lilly Family School of Philanthropy, where Jon Bergdoll serves as the Managing Director of Giving USA. If it's summertime, it must be Giving USA time. And Una, what does this report tell us about charitable giving in 2024?
Well, thank you, Bill, for having us. We're delighted to share the big picture news coming out of this year's Giving USA. Giving USA 2025 tells us that giving reached over $590 billion in the previous year, and giving grew at about 3% adjusted for inflation. So all in all, it was a good year for giving, and a lot of the explanation is the strong performance of financial markets in 2024.
And Una, in terms of current dollars, this is the best year ever, right?
Well, in current dollars, yes, but I also want to remind people when adjusted for inflation, it doesn't quite hit the mark that we achieved right after the pandemic. So we want to caveat that just slightly.
And the inflation gain, 3.3%. How does that compare over the 70 years of the report's history in terms of when we do adjust for inflation?
When we look back, one of the strengths of Giving USA is that we can put this year's report in conversation with other years. And overall, this is actually a pretty strong year, but it fits in right with what we would expect on average. Giving grows about 3% a year, and this year's results really stand up quite nicely with that. And so I'd say that when we look back, this presents a very strong baseline for the previous year.
One thing I enjoy about working with you, Una, is you stick with the data. Your analysis is data-driven. But I do want to ask you about your analysis. This maybe does drift a little bit into the opinion territory. How surprised were you with these numbers? You know, when we hear so much news about inflation and, you know, families having to make difficult decisions at the kitchen table about purchasing and, you know, still the heavy effects of inflation. And yet in current dollars, we have this record high. And in terms of inflation, kind of an average growth year of 3.3%. How surprised were you by what we saw in 2024?
In 2024, I think we were not that surprised, especially when we look back at the previous year and see that the stock market had a record performance, growing almost 20% adjusted for inflation. Now, when we look at all the other elements, of course, the financial sector did well. We look at the real sector, unemployment was actually quite low. GDP had a good year. And then inflation, while still high, moderated quite a bit from the 8% and high rates that we saw during the pandemic. So as we moved into the end of the year, the last quarter, what we start to see with the data, first of all, strong financial markets, but Americans actually showing more confidence in the economy in 2024. And much of that concern about inflation continues to persist, but there was that moderation of inflation, meaning the rates were not as high as they've been. And so that put giving in a strong position. We tend to think that giving grows, or people give when they feel financially and economically secure. And when you put that year into that perspective, you can see why the results were quite strong.
We know that people donate for a myriad of reasons based on their philanthropic values and philanthropic motivations. That's the why they give. The how much and when often depends on these economic factors, the wealth effect of giving, so to speak. And as Una described so well for us, there are so many of those economic factors pointing in a good direction that help explain the charitable giving. And of course, I'm always going to, you know, pat the back of the fundraisers who are out there doing the great work, helping these donors connect to the nonprofits with which they care about. Jon, let me ask you, what about the different categories? People wonder, individuals, foundations, corporations. What does the report about 2024 show us about charitable giving in the USA?
So, I mean, we have seen over the long term this growth in the share of giving being done by foundations, kind of at the expense of individuals, where that's gone from, 5-ish, 6-ish% from foundations now up to 20. That being said, individuals, it's gone from an enormous majority to still a very large majority. And we really saw that in 2024, where growth in giving by individuals was really the major engine for growth in giving overall. And, this giving was sort of reflected across the board in terms of those economic variables, like Una already highlighted. We had very broad, solid foundation or broad, solid economic growth in terms of things like GDP and disposable personal income. And on the high end of things, we had, really strong market growth. So all those things sort of contributed to individuals having a very good year and really pushing giving ahead.
In fact, individuals up 8% in current dollars and 5% still after inflation. Jon, what about foundations? What did we see there?
Foundations were a little interesting in that they only grew by 2.4% in in current dollars. So they did actually stay basically flat once we adjust for inflation. That being said, we've seen very large foundation giving here for the past 3 years. It's been 3 straight years of foundations giving above $100 billion. And all of this kind of followed from the very large asset growth foundations experienced in 2021 due to a mixture of quite a lot of giving going to them, as well as a big expansion of their assets due to the market growth. So since that event in 2021, in the 3 years since, we've seen this really strong foundation giving, even if the growth this year was more muted.
And folks, that's why we're having this conversation. I have to admit, when I first saw that after inflation foundation giving actually went down, I thought, what is up with that? The stock market's been great the last 2 years, and foundations have their money in the stock market, and an increase, it should lead to higher giving. But as Jon emphasized for us there, the difference is foundation giving was up so much higher during those COVID years that by comparison, the giving from foundations went down after adjusting for inflation, but did go up in current dollars. And Jon, kind of last big category people look at, corporations. I'm hearing a lot about a good economy in 2024. What did that mean for corporate giving in that calendar year?
Yeah, we saw another year of really strong corporate giving, which has been a trend over the last several years, actually. And a lot of that ties very simply into corporations having very good years economically as well. We had 9% growth in corporate giving this year, but that's coupled with about 11% growth in corporate pre-tax profits. So, it kind of is, it's a very remarkable amount of growth, but within context, it does make a lot of sense.
And up 6% after adjusting for inflation. Una, let me turn the conversation back to you, please. And that is, who is receiving these dollars? The Giving USA report divides recipient nonprofits into 9 subsectors. What do the data show?
Yes, the data gives us a very clear picture of where the giving is going, the destination of charitable giving. We still see religious congregations of different types as being the single most important recipient of charitable giving. But today, those gifts make up under 30%, which is a big shift from what we have seen in previous decades. In the 60s and 70s, for example, religious congregations made up 2/3 of all giving. Another shift that we've been paying close attention to is the second largest recipient of charitable giving. In the past, that used to be educational institutions. Today, that is the human service sector. Educational institutions are now number 3. Now, they're quite close, but it's worth noting that during the pandemic, Americans really stepped up their giving to basic needs charities. That includes food insecurity, housing, many of those causes. And some of that growth over that time period is reflected in the numbers we see today. Overall, all of the subsectors saw pretty broad-based growth. So this is I think, a very strong baseline heading into the current year. We do see that the sectors that seem to have recovered more are the ones that were particularly hard hit during the pandemic, such as the arts subsector. So all in all, on the destination side, some really strong results overall. And then I would just highlight where we're seeing some of the shifts take place.
And Jon, to geek out on the data a little bit, all 9 subsectors enjoyed an increase in current dollars, second straight year that's happened. How extraordinary is that when you look back over the last 30 or 40 years or so?
When we look at it in terms of current dollars, it does actually happen not frequently, but in the last 40 years, which is basically what we tend to track with the Giving USA publication, we see it 14 times. So not half the time, but not too far from. And sometimes. Sometimes we do see this. Sometimes we see, a week or year for a specific subsector maybe coming down from a big high. I think they were really well posed to have this broad growth this year, in part because 2023 was sort of a more muted year, a little bit weaker in terms there really wasn't anything that saw big runaway growth or had really huge, significant, gifts propping it up or anything. The sort of things that do kind of lead to a decrease even in good times. And so we do see this kind of widespread growth with the recipients this year, which is a very healthy sign for the overall sector, I think.
And Jon, let me ask you a technical question, because this comes up all the time as we teach in the fundraising school, about 6,000 people every year around the world. And a common question is, where do the DAFs fit in? You tell us donor advised funds are growing and growing and growing. Where do I see donor advised funds in these data?
In a little bit all over the place, but they're concentrated. In terms of on the recipient side of things, most of the DAF and most of the gifts to DAFs we're going to see in what we call public society benefit. This is where we count things like Fidelity Charitable or Vanguard, DAF Giving 360, really the sort of largest players in the DAF field. We do count DAFs at community foundations under gifts to foundations because we do consider community foundations as a form of foundation. And then, interestingly, we see some amount of DAFs in virtually every other subsector as well, smaller single-issue DAFs that maybe are supporting a single organization or have a very tight focus on a particular cause area. And I will also point out here that in order to avoid double counting those gifts, because DAFs do tend to act a little bit like pass-throughs, we do only count the net of DAF gifts of those coming in minus those coming out, with those coming out being counted at wherever their final destination is.
And Jon, when they come out, do we count that as coming from individuals who are advising the donor advised fund? Or since money coming out of a DAF is called a grant, does that money come out of the foundation wedge of the pie?
So we count it from the original donor. And so that's in almost all cases going to be individuals. There are corporate ran DAFs, so it's not universally individual, but the vast, vast majority of it is going to be counted as a gift from individuals.
Thank you for that, Jon. Okay, I'm going to get out of the data geek category here. That leads us to the most important question. And the most important question is, so what? What advice do you have for fundraisers as they look at these data? Maybe they love that table that shows the last 40 years of giving. How can fundraisers and the nonprofits that they serve use these data as they plan for the rest of 2025 and into 2026?
Thank you, Bill. That's a great question. The so what is very much on our minds as we look at the data and think about the implications. 2025 is a very different environment than 2024. There's a great deal of uncertainty. There's a lot of volatility, both on the economic side and also just globally on the geopolitical landscape. What we can say from the data that I think will send a message, hopefully one of encouragement in these turbulent times. First, Americans are generous. We see giving. We look back over time, even in times of more volatility and certainly uncertainty, Americans have given, whether that was during natural disasters or economic shocks. So the message is this country has a history, a long-standing tradition of giving and of generosity. The second one is that giving comes from many different sources. One message that is clear from the data is the importance of course, individuals, building relationships, building trust, engaging those individual donors, but also recognizing that in this environment, diversification is important. So looking at across your individual donors, but then looking at the foundation segment, the corporate segment, planned giving. This is a time to really look at diversification. And then finally, as we think about the future, 2025, one other message that's also embedded in the data is the importance of how do nonprofits innovate to meet the moment. In what we've seen, especially in the most recent period with the COVID pandemic, many donors use different methods to give, new vehicles of giving. And this is a time where nonprofits, especially fundraisers, have an opportunity to build their skill set in order to meet the moment. So generosity is a core part of our nation and our communities all across this country. And also, this is also a time where there's a lot of change taking place. And that means really thinking about how do you best meet your mission, but also the importance of innovation at the same time.
Una, thank you so much for that advice to help us apply these data from the Giving USA report. Comes out in 2025, reporting on 2024 charitable giving behavior. Dr. Una Osili is the Associate Director of Research at the Indiana University Lilly Family School of Philanthropy and continues to be cited as one of the top leaders in the American philanthropic sector. And we're also joined today by Jon Bergdoll, the Managing Director of Giving USA, who dives deep into the data and helps us make sense of that, and we can apply that to effective fundraising, which is why you need to make sure you're going online at go.iu.edu/research, and you find all of our schools' research. So look for Giving USA and then synthesize with the other reports that are available free of charge to help you have a data-based, evidence-driven strategy for your fundraising for your nonprofit. Now, along that top toolbar, go over one more. We're next door neighbors to the fundraising school. You'll find our public courses, more than 24 that we offer in person and online. You can learn more about our custom training, our quarterly webinars, and of course, these weekly podcasts are all archived there. And all of our knowledge is gathered in our textbook, Achieving Excellence in Fundraising, the book now out in its 5th edition. Again, the website, go.iu.edu. And for the fundraising school, you do a /TFRS. I'm grateful for our producers today, Jennifer Boffman, CFRM, and our Emmy Award winner, Mike Anthony. I'm Bill Stanczykiewicz. Now you are now more fully informed on this first day from the fundraising school.